Okay, we're going to jump in. Hi, everybody. My name's Shay. Really happy to have you guys with us today. Really appreciate you joining us and having some patience as we learn through some technical difficulties. I do just want to say, too, we have a lot of friends in the upstate, and we're thinking about you and, hoping for the best with what everyone's dealing with the wildfires today. So, again, I want to thank you all for being here, and we're going to go ahead and jump in. So, like I said, my name is Shay McCarthy. I'm the non-point source coordinator with the Bureau of Water in the non-point source program with South Carolina Department of Environmental Services, previously known as DHEC. So our goal for today is to share some information with you all about the available Watershed Plan Development Grant and the application process. So hopefully we'll get you all a little bit more familiar with what's available, share some resources with you. If you have any questions as we go along, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. We've got some moderators keeping an eye there, so they'll make sure that your questions get answered at some point. Also, we have the opportunity at the end of the webinar for some time for questions. So if you'd rather raise your hand and ask your question that way toward the end, that's perfectly fine too. All right. So to begin, the two major goals of the non-point source program are to restore waters that are impaired by non-point source pollution and to protect healthy waters from future implications of non-point source pollution. So our program's focus is on non-point source because it's a major contributor to water quality impairments in our waterways, which, as we know, are widespread and are plenty. So this map on the right here from our Watershed Atlas shows where all of the sites of impairments on our most current 303D list of impairments are. So the primary way that our program works to improve water quality and to meet our goals is by administering two annual grant opportunities. So these are the Watershed Plan Development Grant, which we're here to talk about today, and the Section 319 Grant for Implementation Projects. So there's a lot of benefits to watershed planning, but we can also think of it as a step one toward applying for 319 funding. And that's because to be eligible for a 319 project, you do have to first have an approved watershed plan in that project area. So the watershed plan grant that's available is for interested groups to apply for funding to develop a watershed plan that outlines the guidance for water quality improvement in the future. And there are some eligibility requirements that we're going to go over. This can also be a relatively competitive process. So with those things in mind, just important to note that you can also develop a watershed plan separate from this grant. So they can be made possible through other channels. And even then, those plans can still be submitted to our program for approval, and that would still make them eligible for 319 funding. I'm going to pause for just a second. People are still trickling in. I want to make sure we don't miss anything too important. Okay, once those start to slow, then I think we can jump back in. And of course, once I said that, now it's slowed down, right? Okay, we'll keep moving. So the Watershed Plan Development Grant that we're talking about today, we are accepting applications through May 15th of this year. And then we also plan to release the Section 319 grant RFP in early summer of this year. Both of these grants are made available annually, and they also both have competitive selection processes for funding. So keeping in mind that the goal for both of those programs is the best use of funds to achieve measurable water quality improvement. So getting into some specific details of the Watershed Plan Development Grant. For eligibility, public organizations are welcome to apply for this funding. Private and for-profit organizations can be project partners, but they're not eligible to be grant recipients for this specific grant. An eligible group that's awarded funding can either write the plan internally, or they can choose to hire a consultant with the grant funds to develop the plan for their organization. As far as areas where projects are eligible, we have recently expanded our grant eligibility for this. So any watershed that contains drinking water intakes, contains public wells, or has source water for either of those sources of public drinking water would be an eligible watershed. This grant is funded by the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So one of our priorities is the protection of drinking water. So this map, also from the Watershed Atlas, can help you determine which watersheds meet that criteria. So for this image, we have the layers for source water protection areas and public wells turned on in dark blue. So what is eligible for this grant? It's available to either develop a new watershed plan or to make significant updates to an existing plan. Generally, we like to suggest that watershed plans cover between 1 and 4 HUC 12s. So those are 12-digit hydrologic unit codes, which is a way of classifying watersheds. So we know that there are some scenarios where it might make sense to develop a more comprehensive plan that covers a larger area, or where it's more manageable and maybe more impactful to focus on a smaller area, so maybe just one HUC or portions of HUCs. But again, we're looking for the best opportunity for water quality improvement. So we do encourage selecting a manageable project area, especially for first-time applicants. And we really are looking for somewhere where there's a clear plan for implementation. And important to remember too, that there are opportunities to amend, update, or add to a plan in the future. So if it makes the most sense for your organization to start small and then add on later on, that's always an opportunity as well. So the ultimate goal of watershed planning is to create guidance that informs and inspires water quality improvement in your watershed. There are some important steps and goals to help you get there that include incorporating relevant stakeholders in the watershed, identifying water quality impairments and concerns and their sources of pollutants, recommending solutions through best management practices, or BMPs as we call them, that will help address those problems, and designing a plan for implementation for those practices that have been recommended. So we're going to focus most of today on how to develop a new watershed plan, but I do just want to briefly touch on the opportunity to update an existing plan if there's already one in your watershed. So keeping in mind that our priorities are for the biggest potential impact for water quality improvement, we would consider an application eligible to update an existing plan if it provides justification for significant revisions to the watershed plan. So specifically the watershed analysis or the BMP recommendations in that plan. So for example, if there are really important components missing from an old plan, maybe something like protection efforts that weren't originally included, that might be an opportunity to update. If there's a new TMDL in the area, maybe there's significant or unexpected development or land use change in the watershed. Those could be scenarios where funding might be eligible for an update. One example, and this wasn't funded through our program, but just a great example of a successful update of a watershed plan in May River. They have a watershed action plan that was developed in 2011. So they decided to revisit that plan because there were significant pollutant concerns, especially related to bacteria, and they really wanted to revisit the effectiveness of the recommended practices that they had in that plan. So they considered the rapid development in their area, the changing conditions of their watershed, and also the advancements in scientific evidence and resources that they had in their watershed to create a revision in 2020. And that plan has continued to be implemented successfully. So those are examples of eligible scenarios. On the other hand, we wouldn't consider an application eligible that's really only planning for minor updates and things that would really be considered general maintenance of a plan by an author. So in other words, things that wouldn't have substantial impact on the recommendation or the implementation of the plan wouldn't be a funding priority for our program. Okay, so moving on to the development of a watershed plan and what that entails. So there's 4 major steps that we can consider with watershed plan development, and they're all related and they're all important. So building partnerships, using your existing resources, getting outside into the watershed, and putting everything together. So arguably the most important part of watershed planning is building partnerships because it includes bringing together all of the relevant stakeholders in your watershed, compiling critical information from people who are involved and are experienced in the watershed. And this is really one of the best ways to understand water quality concerns, their sources, and their impacts. So your stakeholders can and should be involved in every step of the process of watershed plan development. So for example, those discussions about pollutants and solutions, maybe holding focus groups, providing surveys to get input, allowing your stakeholders to review the documents that are being written to provide their local experience. We've provided a list of some potential partnership opportunities on the right here, and this list is just the beginning. I do also want to mention that Clemson Extension has a lot of really great water resources available throughout the state. Something else to mention is that some of your partners may also have opportunities for other sources of funding. So for example, NRCS has an EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is a really great option for agricultural practices and can be an opportunity to combine sources of funding. So the next major component of developing a plan is reviewing all of the resources that are already available to you. So really, there's usually no need to do any new data collection or any major analysis of data, right? We already know that there's impairments in these areas, and we really want to focus on researching the best recommendations for those. So for instance, if there's a TMDL for your watershed, that will probably have the majority, if not all, of the relevant watershed analysis that you're looking for in your plan development. Then, of course, you've got the 303D list of impaired waters. DES has a surface water quality monitoring program with data available. You've got local permits and monitoring data available to see what's happening in your watershed. Volunteer monitoring data like AdoptAStream is publicly available. There might be other sources of local monitoring in your watershed. And then things like GIS and mapping, using your land use data to understand your watershed. One example of that we've seen is reviewing public sewer information to try to estimate where there might be septic systems if you're working in a priority area for septic repair. So once you've reviewed everything from your desk, then it's really important to get outside. So traveling through the watershed to identify land uses, things like farmland and livestock locations, looking at your pollution concerns. So things like sedimentation after a rain event, like the photo on the right, things like shoreline erosion, like the photo on, the photo on the left is an example of erosion and sedimentation in Greenville water in the upstate. And then on the right there, we've got a shoreline erosion example from our friends on Edisto. So if you've started developing your partnerships with landowners, you might also use this to get out and see those properties. And this is all really important to start to put it all together, right? So to understand your watershed, the local concerns, and to make recommendations that are specific to those areas. So after you've worked with your partners, you've compiled all your information, and you've gotten to know your watershed, then it's time to put it all together into a document that can serve as guidance for water quality improvement in your watershed. So we have a lot of resources available for you to hopefully help with the process of developing a plan. The first one is the SCDES Guide to Developing Watershed Plans. So this has been developed to try to simplify the required sections of watershed planning. And what this does is lay out what's needed for our approval through our program. So a successful plan should have a watershed overview, so a summary of all of those available resources that we mentioned. It should also address each of EPA's 9 required elements, which we'll cover in the next slides. And you should also include recommendations for protection efforts in addition to restoration. So as you go through this document, as long as you're addressing each of the included sections, that's really everything that we're looking for in our program for a complete and approvable watershed plan. So your organization, your partners might decide to include other elements, but just keeping in mind that they might not be in our program's priorities. And a successful watershed plan that we're looking for would be concise, they're localized, they're specific to the watershed, and they're ready to be implemented. So any interested party could pick up that plan, read through it, and have a really clear understanding of what's going on in the watershed and next steps for implementation. I don't know if we have any of our friends from Edisto on today, but a really great example there is that Clemson Extension developed the Edisto Island Watershed Plan, and the first 319 implementation project that we have there is actually from a partner who wasn't directly involved in writing the watershed plan, what was partnered but wasn't the lead organization, I'll say. But he was a really great example of he picked up the plan, he read through it, and he saw how he could start implementation in his watershed. So it is required as part of this grant program for a watershed plan to be eligible to apply for 319 funding, that it includes these 9 required elements from EPA. There is a handbook available from EPA. It's pretty lengthy, a handbook to developing watershed plans. It's helpful, but there is a lot of information there, but it does also cover each of the 9 required elements. But we'll go over each of them and sort of what they entail. So they include identifying your causes of impairments and pollutant sources. So this can include point sources and non-point sources to be thorough in your watershed. And then I'm going to skip to C just because some of this order is a little bit counterintuitive, but describing management measures, which is what we call BMPs, best management practices, that you plan to implement. And then back to B, estimating load reductions that are expected from those recommended BMPs. And we do have staff and we have tools available to assist you with this. And then estimating your technical and financial assistance. So listing out anything like consultants, engineered plans, volunteers, partnerships, land access, equipment, things that might be needed for implementation. And also listing out your potential funding sources. So things like 319 and EQIP, maybe SRF for larger projects. Then describing the informational and educational components that are recommended to supplement on-the-ground implementation. So this is also a requirement for 319 project implementation. So for every on-the-ground BMP that you recommend, it should also have a supplemental education or outreach component. And then continuing on here, the 9 elements also include creating a schedule for anticipated implementation. So that includes measurable milestones. So for example, say you have a 5-year implementation plan. Some measurable milestones might include identifying priority project areas, applying for funding, installing BMPs, and providing educational materials to targeted audience, just for a few examples. Then H, how will you determine measures of success? So it could be improvements in water quality monitoring data. It could be installing a certain amount of BMPs, educating a certain group of people, for example. And lastly, how will you track improvements through monitoring? So again, you can use what's available to you. So the DES Surface Water Monitoring Program data, USGS water data, Adopt-A-Stream volunteer data if you have some local to your area. There might be other sources of monitoring data in your local university or county. And then next we have just a general list of common examples of BMPs that might be recommended in a plan. So a few ways that we can think about these. They can be practices that reduce the availability of a pollutant, things that slow a pollutant from transporting into a water body, or things that treat a pollutant before it can reach a water body. So some examples of recommendations that we pretty commonly see in 319 projects are for septic, the repair or replacement of a failing system or sewer tie-on in an area where the failure is causing an environmental impact. Stream improvement can include stream bank restoration, stream bank stabilization, in-stream structures, buffer plantings. We can do agricultural practices like heavy use area stabilization, livestock exclusion fencing, cover crop programs. Stormwater practices can include improving infiltration, pervious pavement, rain gardens, bioretention areas. We've mentioned before that protection is also a priority of our program. So a really good example of that is pursuing conservation easements to prevent future development or future land uses that would threaten water quality. And then lastly here, nature-based solutions. So things like green infrastructure, things that mimic natural hydrology. So stream daylighting, native plantings, and rain gardens. Another really great resource that's available to you is your watershed coordinator. So we have 3 team members that cover different regions of the state, and you'll hear from each of them briefly today. They're a really great resource for technical assistance. They can help you to build partnerships. They can be part of your focus group meetings, and they can also assist with technical things like load reduction calculations. Another great resource that's available to you is the South Carolina Watershed Atlas. It's an interactive web map. And I'm going to hand it over to Shelly Hoover, one of our watershed coordinators, and she's going to take you through that.
Hey everyone, my name is Shelly, and I'm going to do a brief overview of the Watershed Atlas. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So first off, we're going to start by navigating to the Atlas from your browser. Here I'm using Google, so we're just going to use SC Watershed Atlas. And that first link that pops up is the one you're going to want to use. And in this welcome screen, you're just going to hit OK. So the first screen that pops up is your watershed basins, and that is your layer that will initially pop up. The next, we're going to navigate some of the main features and just kind of browse and how that can help you in the watershed planning. The first one is your search bar. You can search your addresses and add a marker to your area. You'll see a long list that comes up, and you'll want to click the one that best suits your search. So we'll go to Columbia. And you'll see your box come up in your location. To hold that location, you can click this arrow for more information and use the ellipses and add a marker. Now you can clear out and search wherever else you want to go while still holding that marker. So the next big feature is your table of contents on the left-hand side, and this is all the layers that are available on the atlas. So we'll start with the national watershed boundaries. You can use this down arrow on the left side. And of course, the major river basins, like we saw earlier, are already turned on. We're going to go ahead and turn on the 12-digit watershed hooks. And as Shay mentioned earlier, for watershed plans, we usually like to see 1 to 4 used in a plan. So that you'll be able to visualize these hooks here. Moving along, we'll keep this on and close that layer, and we'll open up the public water supply. And we can turn on our surface water intakes and our surface water protection areas. So here you can see with the hooks turned on and the surface water protection areas and your surface water intakes turned on, you can see what is included in each of your hooks. And as she also mentioned, the public water supply wells will now be eligible. And you can see that greatly increases the eligibility areas. So we'll go ahead and turn these off by just unhighlighting and closing this layer. And we'll open up the water quality monitoring tab. Here you can see a bunch of different water quality monitoring data that is available. So we'll turn on our fixed ambient surface. We can zoom back in and you can see these icons available. You can click these and get more information. And if you are not able to highlight this immediately and it's highlighting the entirely different layer, you can use these toggle arrows to get to whichever one you're trying to reach. So we'll go back to our ambient surface and click this more arrow. And here you'll get the station name. And again, you can use these ellipses to add a marker if needed. But with that station name, you can come to the top at this top bar and you can click Water Quality Data Portal. And that will bring you to the portal for more information on that station. And to the right of that, we have portal instructions, which is also a link to a PDF that will show you how to use that water quality data portal. So we'll close this layer and we'll move right along to our water quality assessments. And this is where you're going to be able to see your 303D sites and your approved TMDL sites. And again, like before, you'll be able to click these icons. Like here, this did not highlight because they're quite small. So you can toggle and find that site. When you click the more information, you'll be able to get the station name, the type, and the basin that it's in, and its description. So this is the Smith Branch TMDL site. And earlier in the chat, the approved 303D list and TMDL list were sent, and that is where you're going to get more information on these sites and specifics. So we'll go ahead and turn these off and close that layer and open up our non-point source program. So here you'll be able to see your watershed plans, your 319 grant projects that are open and closed, and our previous success stories. So we'll turn on our watershed-based plans, and you can zoom out and see if there are plans in your area and where they are not. You can see there's a few spaces that are not included. But again, like Shay said, to have a 319 grant project, there must be a watershed-based plan. And in these areas, the hatch mark is your 319 grant projects. And the areas where you see there's no brown behind it, that is prior to the requirement of there being a plan in the area for a 319 project. And again, you'll be able to click on that area and use that toggle button. And this will highlight your 319 grant project. And you can get more information, so the name, water body, the organization, the year that it was written, and its status. And we'll toggle to the watershed base plan and get more information. So Gills Creek, it was a 2009 plan and it was written privately. And the impairments were bacteria, dissolved oxygen, and mercury. And that is for all, you'll be able to get that information. So this is the Three Rivers plan written in 2022. You can click more info and it will take you to the document. So go ahead and turn these layers off. And those will be the most helpful for your watershed planning development. We'll move right along to the next area.
Thanks, Shelly. Okay. Hopefully you're seeing my slides again. So jumping back into some more of the grant information. So some important things to keep in mind if you're considering applying for this grant. You should, of course, review the request for proposals document that's available on our webpage, as well as the proposal form. Make sure that you're familiar with the requirements of the RFP. You should definitely start talking with your stakeholders as soon as possible. So there's an opportunity in your application to share letters of support and letters of commitment from your partners. And it's really important to start working on those partnerships in advance. So maybe even holding an interest meeting ahead of time to help you understand the direction for your application. Also, you can contact your watershed coordinator for assistance. So our team is available to help you out. If you happen to have a draft proposal and we have enough time, you can also submit that for our team to review on a first come, first served basis before the grant proposals are due. And again, that application is due by the end of the day on May 15th. They're due by email submission, so you will hear from us pretty quickly if we've received your submission. So if a couple hours go by and you haven't heard anything, maybe make sure and check your outbox, make sure that that's not stuck somewhere on your end. Sometimes that happens with big files, especially when there's maps included. So you can look out for that email confirming that we've received your application, and feel free to reach out to us if you haven't gotten that. After we receive applications, there will be a committee review and a funding selection process. We anticipate being able to give notification of funding in June. We'll let you know either way, and then pretty quickly that'll be followed by entering into the grant agreement process. So in your application, there's a detailed budget Excel sheet. There's also a budget narrative that allows you to describe how you plan to spend the funds that you're applying for. So there's obvious things that go into writing a watershed plan, like salary or contractual fees if you're hiring a consultant. But this is also your opportunity to talk about how the funds will be spent to specifically benefit your watershed. So for example, your travel time to complete site visits, if you're doing windshield surveys, any plans for community engagement events, education and outreach materials. It's also really important to note that this grant does not have a match funding requirement. So there is an opportunity in your application to mention if there are other funding sources being used, but there's not any need to report on any supplemental funding for this grant. Only the grants that are awarded, the grant funds that are awarded through this process. Okay, so a project is selected for funding. What happens next? That organization will enter into a grant agreement with DES. The grant timeline is generally planned for about 2 years. As I mentioned, there's not any requirement for match funding. And any eligible invoices are paid by reimbursement on a quarterly basis during the open grant period. And along with quarterly invoices, there's also a quarterly progress report due for each quarter of the life of the project. Once a watershed plan is complete, the next step is approval. So as you're working on your plan, continue to work with your watershed coordinator to answer any questions, to keep them informed of the progress that you're making. Also involve your stakeholders in the development of your plan and in the review of the plan. So oftentimes grantees who have a watershed plan development grant will send out for an open comment period to their stakeholders. We really encourage that. We do just encourage that it's done with enough time that you can incorporate those comments before submitting that to our program for final review. Then a complete draft of your watershed plan is due to our program 90 days before the close of the grant date. So then we can begin the review and approval process while the grant period is still open. That gives us an opportunity for revisions and suggestions for different versions of the watershed plan. And once that plan is approved through our program, it does become public. It's published both on our website and on the Watershed Atlas. So that plan then becomes eligible to be used to apply for 319 implementation funding based on those BMP recommendations. Once those plans are approved and published, they are eligible for use by anyone who comes across them. So not just the authors of the plan. Anyone in the watershed who's an eligible applicant is able to use that public plan to apply for funding. And then an important thing to note here is that DES can withhold 10% of the grant award for a watershed plan development grant that will only become available if the watershed plan is approved while the grant period is still open. So this is just our way of making sure that we can get that plan to a complete and an approvable process before that grant period closes, to try to avoid keeping the work going on it after that grant period closes. At that point, we're not able to make any more reimbursement payments to the organization. And then as a reminder, that watershed plans can be developed separate from this grant so they can be funded in other ways. And those plans can be submitted to us to our program at any time for approval, and we can start that process. So I'm going to hand it over to our two other watershed coordinators, Cynthia McBride and Amanda Lay, to share some successes in watershed planning. You're still muted, Cynthia.
There we go. That worked. Okay. Good morning, afternoon. I am Cynthia McBride. I am the watershed coordinator for the Midlands Mid-State region, and one of the excellent examples of collaboration in watershed planning in York County is the watershed evaluation team that was began by Rick Lee from Rock Hill. It was established in 2022, and its purpose was to better understand and manage York County's water resources. It includes some stakeholders from a variety of jurisdictions in York County. That includes Fort Mill, TKK, Rock Hill, City of York, let's see, the Catawba Nation and the Council of Governments and the Catawba Indian Nation. The next slide will show that this watershed group earned the Power of Partnerships Award on January 24th. It was awarded by Lieutenant Governor Pamela Everett and SCDES Director Myra Reese. And some of the plans that this group was able to write and have approved was the Big Dutchman, Tools Fork, Burgess Creek, and 6 Mile Creek. So they are definitely a good example of the variety of watershed plans that can be written through collaboration. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Lay. I'm the Western Region Watershed Coordinator, and we just wanted to share with you some of Upstate Forever's successful approaches to using GIS and data to make implementation recommendations. Shay mentioned earlier about using mapping and some GIS applications, and so that's what we're talking about here. Upstate Forever does create some maps that identify priority areas for different categories, like the examples that you see here: land protection, septic system repair, ag BMPs, and stormwater BMPs. The methodology for mapping these prioritization areas includes developing specific criteria and possible points to evaluate each criteria in the focus area. And by using this methodology, it's really helpful to determine where those BMPs should be best placed, and how doing that, water quality is going to be more likely to show improvement. So just sharing this map as an example, this is from the 3 and 20 watershed plan, and it is showing priority areas for septic repairs and replacement. And you can see how that is kind of following along some of those major water bodies there. I would say for more information about methodology and how they got that information, I would visit some of their watershed plans that we have available on our webpage. And the ones that I would recommend looking at are the 12 Mile, Lake Kiwi, 3 and 20, and Tiger watershed plans. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So that is all we have for you all today. You've got our entire team available here for you today. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. You can drop them in the chat. If you raise your hand, we can also unmute if you'd like to ask a question that way. This means we answered all your questions, right? Awesome. Sharon raised her hand here. 1 second. Okay. I think you should be able to unmute now,
Okay,
Sharon.
can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, quick question. I know the focus is on, prioritizing watersheds where there's public, source water for drinking. What if we've got a watershed where we're trying to restore like the shellfish harvest closure that's, adversely impacted by non-point? Do you know funding sources for that? And
So as long as the project area meets the eligibility of having drinking water intakes or source water for drinking water intakes, that's showing that that's one of the priorities of the plan. There can be other priorities. So if you're also looking at other sources of pollutants, other goals outside of drinking water protection, you're still eligible for funding. So
okay,
the drinking water eligibility has to do with what areas are eligible. It doesn't mean that that can be your only focus, your only priority for the plan. Does that make sense?
so as long as we're hitting the drinking water aspect of it and improving that, we can also have other priorities.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Shay, we had a question from David from the Broad River, North Carolina Riverkeeper. He was asking if North Carolina would be eligible, just saying that they have extraterritorial jurisdiction down to Lockhart, and he's wondering if he's eligible.
Okay, that's a great question. So as far as my understanding goes, these funds are only available for South Carolina public organizations. If there's any changes in that, we'll of course we'll let you guys know. We would put that out there, but as for now, as far as I know, that's what the funds are limited to. Would have to be a state public organization. And
There may
working
be some,
in working
may-
within state boundaries.
there might be something that he could also look up for North Carolina, maybe SRF funding through North Carolina or 319 funding through North Carolina.
Yeah, I would definitely say to start with your 319 program, your non-point source program in North Carolina. A lot of states do their they fund their watershed planning through their 319 program as well. Any other questions? Appreciate you guys in the chat. Hopefully we got some new information for you guys today and got you a little bit more familiar with the process. Hopefully it doesn't seem too daunting. Any other questions coming up?
If I could jump in for just a moment to go back to address a previous question. There is a section on our website for other funding for watershed planning, and we've got a few opportunities listed there. So check that out, and if you know of more opportunities for funding, send them our way, and we will add those as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Chanda. So just so you all know, this recording for today, we're going to have up on our webpage probably later this week. I know some people had to jump on a little bit late. Some of the things you might want to go back and see again. So this recording will be available to you. Also, please feel free to reach out. You've got each of our contacts here. We'd be happy to help you and answer any other questions that might come up. I do think you also have access to this chat after the meeting is over. So all of these links that have been sent, you should be able to access as well. I'll do one last call for questions. All right. If we don't have anything, we'll let you guys go. And we really appreciate you guys being on. We hope this has been helpful for you. And if you need anything, we'll hope to talk to you soon. Thanks.